the Dr. Hyder Show, and I'm so pleased today to have on Dr. Peter Mccullough and John Leake. They are co-authors on a new book, The Courage to Face COVID-19, and you can find that at couragetofacecovid.com, which should be up on your screen. And that's what we're going to be talking about. So just to give an introduction to both of them, for anyone who has not heard of Dr. Mccullough, he's an internist, cardiologist, epidemiologist, and he has a lot of experience managing the cardiovascular complications of both the COVID infection, the viral infection, and the injuries that develop afterwards, and especially due to the COVID vaccine, based out of Dallas, Texas. And so since the outset of the pandemic, Dr. Mccullough has been a leader in the medical response to the COVID-19 disaster, and he's published a number of papers, actually, one of them, Pathophysiological Basis and Rationale for Early Outpatient Treatment of SARS-CoV-2 Infection. This was the first synthesis of sequenced multi-drug treatment of ambulatory patients infected with SARS-CoV-2 in the American Journal of Medicine. And after that, it was later updated in Reviews in Cardiovascular Medicine. He has dozens of peer-reviewed publications just on the infection, and probably hundreds on other things, as far as I know, and has commented extensively on the medical response to the COVID-19 crisis in The Hill, America Out Loud, and on Fox News. On November 19th, 2020, he testified in the U.S. Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs, and in 2021, 2022, the Texas Senate Committee on Health and Human Services, and a bunch of other assemblies in other states throughout the country, and he's just done tremendous work. So his book, this book that he's co-written with John Leake, is again, Courage to Face COVID-19, Preventing Hospitalization and Death While Battling the Bio-Pharmaceutical Complex. And just to give a brief introduction to author John Leake, he studied history and philosophy with Sir Roger Scruton at Boston University. He then attended graduate school in Austria and worked as a freelance writer, translator. His first book was Entering Hades, The Double Life of a Serial Killer, and that was published and got favorable reviews. It was chosen as editor's choice by the New York Times Sunday Book Review, and by Men's Vogue is the best book of 2007. And his second book, Cold, A Long Time in an Alpine Mystery, was winner of the 2012 Independent Publisher Award. And so he, at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, saw that the official response was illogical at best. He later saw a video of Dr. Mccullough in front of the U.S. Senate and could tell, as I think most of us can when we hear and see Dr. Mccullough, that he was one of the leaders in developing a more rational and humane response to the crisis. So without further ado, I've spoken a lot. Welcome, John Leake and Peter Mccullough. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm not sure who to start with, but maybe just tell me a little bit about how you two met, how you came across each other, and what was the inspiration for writing this book together. So, Dr. Mccullough, perhaps you can go first.
Well, I'll let John tell the story. Really did so much of the original groundwork in bringing it.
Okay, go ahead, John.
I am, as you mentioned, a true crime author. I was here in my native Dallas at the beginning of 2020 when SARS-CoV-2 arrived, and I quickly perceived that there's something very strange, perhaps even suspect, about the official policy response and the way the media was presenting this crisis to the American public. I can't seem to get my tie straight. So I thought, what on earth is going on here? To me, it had elements of, fraudulent misrepresentation of what was going on. So a distinct element of fraud. And then I began to suspect, with this higher risk group, people over the age of 65, people who had metabolic problems, high blood sugar, diabetes, and so forth. This high risk group, it seemed to me that this impeding of access to repurposed medications that could really help these people, a sort of propaganda campaign being waged against these repurposed drugs, I began to suspect that this might even rise to the level of negligent homicide on a mass scale. So my instincts as a true crime author were engaged. I realized I needed to find a top medical authority who would help me to understand the technical medical aspects of what we were looking at. So I got into touch with Dr. Mccullough, who incidentally lives about 2 miles from my home in Dallas. And we got together exactly a year ago and started working on this book together, and we've just now published it.
That's amazing. So, Dr. McCullough, from your point of view, what really, I'm sure writing a book is a big endeavor. So, what brought you to the point where you were like, I just have to bring out this story, and I need to talk about it and write about it, actually.
I've spent my entire career publishing in the medical literature. I think I'm coming up on 700 peer-reviewed papers, cited in the National Library of Medicine. I'm the most published person in the interface between heart and kidney disease in history. I'm actually the most published cardiologist in the nephrology literature. So I've worked across 2 organ systems. And despite a U.S. Senate testimony, I was a frequent contributor in the first year in The Hill, a conservative journal in Washington. The second year, now issue a report to the nation, America Out Loud Talk Radio, the Mccullough Report. What was missing in all that was a narrative. We've heard so much about the government narrative on COVID-19 and pandemic response, but we haven't really heard anything about the narrative of the doctors and the patients and our initial scramble in trying to find ways of reducing the severity and intensity of symptoms. And by that mechanism, reduce really the scary and deadly outcomes of hospitalization and death. The patients I talked to and the family members I talked to, they were scared to death of COVID-19 because of 2 reasons. One, they could be put in the hospital and in isolation, may never see their loved ones again, or worse, they could die. Those were the 2 big things on every person's mind, particularly our senior citizens, those with heart and lung disease, kidney disease, diabetes, and obesity. They were petrified in these first few months of the pandemic. And I think everybody who opens up the book can understand that there's a story that has a beginning, a middle, and end. And John Leake, as you pointed out, is a masterful writer. And I think really the whole world will find this very relatable and compelling.
Yeah, definitely. So, Mr. Leake, what was kind of your hook, to get people interested in the story? I mean, it probably didn't take much since we've all lived through this time in the last couple of years. But how did you kind of gain an entry into the story, and and how did you build that story going forward in the course of your book? How did you approach it?
Well, I was thinking, I like history. I've studied it for 40 years. I like medical history and I like military history. So I quickly began to think the arrival of SARS-CoV-2 is something analogous to a military invasion. It's not human beings with weapons. It's an invisible microbe that's everywhere. So in some ways, it's even more frightening than armed humans because you can't see it. And our public health authorities and our media were representing this thing as an insidious and unassailable microbe that's coming to get us. I mean, I remember here in Dallas County, the Dallas County judge who has emergency authority or invokes emergency authority, he told us to shelter in place. So it's like, my goodness, I mean, that almost sounds like we're going back to Paleolithic times where we shelter in caves against hostile invaders or T-Rexes. So it felt like an invasion. So I open with this metaphor of an invasion. But then the story quickly gets weird because if it were a foreign army that were invading, we know that our young soldiers and their officers would be scrambling to figure out how to defend the people from the foreign invader. And, you may not have the best weapons. They may not be, 100% tried and true to be the most effective weapons, the cutting edge, but you try something. And you try something to protect the people from the foreign invader. And this began to shape my concept of the narrative. It seems strange to me that doctors like Dr. Mccullough, Dr. Vladimir Zelenko in New York, there's a whole regiment of them in our book. They scramble bravely to try and figure out how to treat this thing, but they quickly encounter resistance from our national public health authorities and from the media, who is asserting categorically there is no fighting this enemy. It's unassailable. There's no treatment. None of the drugs or supplements or anything that mankind has devised to fight viral infections or the symptoms, none of it works. The only thing that we can all do, every man, woman, and child, regardless of your age or health, we can only stay at home and wait for a vaccine. There's a new vaccine. It's like this new weapon is being developed and tested. And as soon as this new weapon is available, then we'll be able to go back to normal. So that was my basic concept for telling the story. So we see in real time how this unfolds.
I see. That makes sense. So, Dr. McCullough, from your perspective, as a practicing physician for, I would assume, decades at that point in time when the pandemic hit, what was it something unprecedented? The pandemic, first of all, was it an unprecedented event that required an unprecedented response? And did the response make any sense to you? And were you surprised at what the medical establishment ended up doing in the next 2 years?
That's actually a great question. I've never had that one before. Yeah, I think it was unprecedented. Certainly a ubiquitous viral upper respiratory tract infection that could sweep in. We had had prior flu pandemics, but I think nothing that rose to this level. And I think what was even more unprecedented was the response. So even during a difficult influenza year, there would be notices that would come through the health system emails to be wary of influenza. We've always had influenza vaccine programs for healthcare workers that were strongly encouraged, but there was clearly one could opt out of them. And we knew that the rates of opting out of such vaccination programs were, a couple percent. Nobody had a problem with the influenza vaccine, nor did anybody really put much stock into it in terms of protection. But here in the pandemic, as John points out, in Dallas County, our Dallas County judge, which is effectively our Dallas County executive, in March, said that we would need to wait, sheltering in place and in lockdown, and wait for a vaccine. And so the question is, how did he know? How did he know there's going to be a vaccine? How could people have anticipated this? Vaccines for respiratory illnesses have a terrible track record. Influenza vaccine efficacy many times is below 50%. Recently, the pneumococcal vaccine, the 13-valent pneumococcal vaccine efficacy was published in JAMA. And, we've actually strongly advised the Pneumovax. I've done in my practice for years. I'm an internist and cardiologist, strongly advised it for seniors over 65. You know what the protection was against hospitalization and death with the pneumococcal vaccine?
It varies by years, though, right? Every year there's some variation.
Well, influenza varies per year, almost always below 50%. But the pneumococcal vaccine.
Oh, the pneumococcal vaccine, right?
Cumulatively, 9%. 9%. I mean, in general, if there's vaccine efficacy less than 50%, and if it's less than a year, one can conclude that it is minimally effective. Completely optional if one wants to do that. But these are very low because the sinuses and the upper respiratory tract, they're the point of entry for viruses and inhaled bacteria, etc. And so the sinuses are relatively shielded from systemic immunity. The sinuses have immunoglobulin A, IgA, their own T cell and mucosal macrophage cell system in the sinuses, and they're not well charged with a shot in the deltoid muscle. And so one wouldn't expect, if we had a nasal mist vaccine, that'd be a different story. But an intramuscular injection to save us from this respiratory illness, it really was far-fetched from the very beginning. But our story really has to do with the relatively intentional suppression of early treatment and the successful rollout of what I call an oblivion. Do you know that the clinics, hospitals, medical groups, media, the journals, they basically together coalesced in an oblivion to early treatment. We saw no updates on TV. There were no updates on radio. Our federal agencies provided no updates. The medical schools provided no community forums. Americans were not told anything of what to do when they developed this potentially deadly infection. Nothing. And this has gone on for 2 years now. You'd think somebody would have an interest in giving Americans at least an action plan on self-preservation, kind of a survival instruction sheet for COVID-19, but yet no instruction sheet came. And we found blockade after blockade, resistance after resistance. In fact, we found subversion. We found active attempts to actually stop our efforts in treating patients.
Yeah, I think I've had that experience, and it was really bizarre. John, I wanted to ask you, as you were going through this, what are some of the most surprising things that you learned that you did not know before? Can you think of anything?
It's funny. There's this old convention in detective novels, follow your gut. And I mean, my gut instincts were telling me it just doesn't make sense to categorically, from the outset, state there is no treatment. I mean, I know that the common cold can be, a tough one to treat. I know that influenza, their antivirals, can be tough to treat. I mean, there aren't really any silver bullets with respiratory illnesses. But just to say absolutely 100% nothing works against this, not even fractionally works. I mean, this is a concept that I think a lot of people struggle with. I mean, it's not that it just cures it overnight. It's not like penicillin against a bacterial infection where you kind of almost miraculously, start to feel better, but just enough to keep you from getting really into trouble. There was no even reference to the possibility of that. And I just thought, this can't be true. This doesn't make sense. And so as I got into my research and started meeting with Dr. Mccullough and going over all of our notes in the literature, what we realized is that, in fact, there was a number of observers in the world, mostly in China, South Korea, and the south of France and Marseille, who were observing that some of these agents, which were very well known, which had been around for a long time, hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin being the two most notable, there was plenty of observational and then even trial data, not enormous trials, but there was strong reason to believe that these safe medications offered a significant enough signal of benefit to justify using them amongst high-risk people. So what I discovered is I put together a timeline, which is very useful when you're doing an investigation. Literally go, day to day, week to week, look at public pronouncements, policy announcements, put together a timeline. It became clear to me that early treatment was deliberately suppressed with a massive propaganda campaign and with massive intrigue in our public federal health institutes in Washington. So it's a massive constructive fraud, propaganda campaign, and ultimately mass negligent homicide. If you have a sick man and you deny him access to medications, or you discourage him, or even through the Department of Health outlaw them, I personally, as a matter of logic, I don't see how that's different from a guy falls overboard in rough seas and cold water, not throwing him a life ring. Fundamentally, I don't see a big difference. I mean, with illness, it's more a matter of probability. You're not sure that it's going to progress to hospitalization, but the probability is significant that it will. So how do you justify denying access to medicines that could help these people? So it's shocking that this would be perpetrated on such a broad level, but the totality of circumstances shows that it was. And we can talk about why exactly and why human beings can participate in such a perfidious thing. But I think in terms of the evidence, it's clear that this happened. So it's a fundamentally shocking story. It's a very dark chapter in human history. And I think we're just now realizing just how dark it is.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Something that I've been reminded of is that, we've gone through periods in human history that were quite dark, and as moderns, we kind of look back and think that we've evolved beyond what our ancestors did, right? But a lot of the response looks to me like the Spanish Inquisition going after heretics. So, Dr. Mccullough, I wanted to kind of ask you, looking back over modern medicine, the history over the last maybe 100 years, is this like a systemic problem that's just now kind of rearing its ugly head, but it's always been there? Do we see similarities to anything in the past over the last 10, 20, 50, 100 years to today? And or was this something entirely new and diabolical? Was there some diabolical plan, or is this really a systemic kind of issue that needs to be addressed at a structural level going forward to prevent something like this happening again?
That's a great question. And there are some interesting threads. I just finished interviewing for the Mccullough report Dr. Adipole in Thailand. And he's a real expert on COVID-19. And for the first time, I learned that some of the ancient Asian remedies that were used to help people ease through the Spanish flu. And remember, the goal here is we're not really curing the illness. We're just getting people to ease through it so they don't go into this cycle of anxiety, respiratory failure, and then ultimately respiratory failure that is not resuscitatable. So just, symptomatic relief is really what we're looking for. Some of the earliest Chinese and ancient Asian approaches used in the Spanish flu are actually ones used today across Asia for SARS-CoV-2 infection. I thought that was an interesting thread. Now, I think the main answer to your question, though, has to do with skepticism. And how strong is skepticism as an initial resistance to an innovation? Many of your listeners will know that skepticism is actually considered an objective indicia as a criteria for a patent. So, an original idea, there should be skepticism. There should be teaching away. There should be a school of thought that doesn't look favorably upon the new idea. That's actually a criterion for a patent. So in many ways, early treatment of COVID-19 as a concept was clearly patentable. And the same was true for so many other illnesses. So the very first doctor who put a patient on the iron lung machine for polio, that doctor was ridiculed. He was thrown off staff. He was humiliated. I mean, that occurred in modern history. That occurred in the last 100 years. Now, the very first doctor who proposed that we put an angioplasty balloon in a coronary artery and try to open it up in the setting of a heart attack or even electively for coronary atherosclerosis was met with great skepticism. Even at the FDA review committee, I trained under a legendary cardiologist who proposed primary angioplasty for acute myocardial infarction. The resistance that we met from academia was extraordinary. Academia was completely subscribed to thrombolytics, led by major pharmaceutical companies, including Genentech. And so the wars in cardiology of primary angioplasty versus thrombolytics raged on. And in the end, primary angioplasty won. We actually won. The community doctors won and proved to the ivory tower that the best approach was to go for acute coronary angiography and intervention in ST segment elevation and MI. And I give great credit to the community doctors that did that. Now, fast forward, here we are with SARS-CoV-2 pandemic. It was the community doctors, the independent practitioners who are attempting to treat patients. Vladimir Zelenko gets great credit. Didier Riault in France and others. I just happened to be within the ivory tower, but had the same idea that I wasn't going to let my patients become slaughtered by the virus. I wasn't going to let my family members get slaughtered to the virus. So I felt, as John indicated, I felt a duty to treat. The real question is, why mentally did my colleagues not feel that same duty to treat? Why were my colleagues not with me on this one?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question to ask. And I think it gets maybe to the heart of the issue in modern medicine. Again, for you, I'd like to ask, we've had a move towards evidence-based medicine in the last decades, and so I'd just like you to touch briefly, perhaps, upon this idea of the different levels of evidence and how do we determine truth in medicine, and how does medicine move forward, right? So traditionally, or even today, like where does real change and innovation come from? Does it come from top down or bottom up? Where can we really find innovative new treatments, and where can we move the ball down the field in medicine? And can we do we need to rely on extremely expensive, gigantic, randomized controlled trials for any sense that this intervention truly safe, it truly makes a difference? Or can we collect together, one of the criticisms from the mainstream, was that, oh, there's the data is weak, right? And we don't trust it. So if you could just speak briefly to that idea.
Yeah, so to apply the analogy, someone could look at that life preserver and say, it looks weak, it doesn't look trustworthy. So therefore, I think I'm not going to throw it out and try to save the sailor that went overboard. One has to really look carefully at that statement. And I think the duty to treat actually overrides any hesitation on evidence-based medicine. We have two important documents to apply to that question. The first is the 21st Century Cures Act. And that act says, as we are trying to consider treatments and therapies for populations, we must consider all the evidence, including large randomized trials, but also prospective cohort studies, retrospective studies, case control. Actually, the entire body of evidence must be considered. We certainly would not want to wait for large randomized trials. A large randomized trial in SARS-CoV-2 infection, we're talking 20 to 40,000 patients. In a therapy trial, that would take 2 to 4 years. I know because I do these trials. So I knew we couldn't wait for large randomized trials. The other piece of evidence to look at is the Cochrane collaboration out of the UK. The Cochrane collaboration is carefully analyzed. When we see the results of randomized therapeutic trials and retrospective cohort studies and non-randomized studies, they largely agree when we get a sufficient number of studies. So for instance, hydroxychloroquine, we're over 300 studies, some randomized, some non-randomized, but they largely agree early. Hydroxychloroquine has a modest benefit, about 25% benefit. With ivermectin, we now have 83 studies, over 35 randomized trials. And again, they largely agree a benefit, a greater benefit, actually about a 55% benefit. And now we have studies with Paxlovid and molnupiravir and the monoclonal antibodies. I'll go on and on. But the idea is we have a sufficient body of evidence to declare a signal of benefit. All we needed was a signal of benefit with these early repurposed drugs and acceptable safety. And we are completely in line with the FDA guidance. The FDA is a nice piece out in 2018 to patients. It says, why is your doctor using a drug off its original advertising label? And the answer is the original advertising label by the company couldn't anticipate the future use. And the doctor is fulfilling an unmet need. And we had a big one with SARS-CoV-2. So I think the arguments for early treatment are so compelling and so well supported. And the attempts to dissuade early treatment, or those who claim there wasn't enough evidence. And it was claimed actually in the historic U.S. Senate hearings in November 2020. It was claimed that the proposal to treat patients would give false hope. And that false hope was such a detriment, according to the minority chairman, Gary Peters at the time, that the false hope was so sufficiently deleterious in his mind, there should be no early treatment. So I think this presents an interesting set of moral dilemmas.
Yeah, definitely does. So I'm wondering, John, did you, as you were, going down the rabbit hole and, researching all of this, you had alluded to earlier criminal activity by different parties. And so did you find any smoking guns where, government was in bed with industry, or, somebody or some organization really did something that was blatantly wrong, and should result in criminal charges being brought against them. So I think you're muted. Are you muted? Can't hear you. John, I can't hear you. Can you hear me? All right. Let's maybe try reconnecting. I still can't hear you. Let me try.
I think he was giving the symbol for reconnecting. That's a good symbol, actually.
Yeah. John, why don't you disconnect and try reconnecting? And because I tried reconnecting you myself, that didn't work. But if you log out.
Right. I'll pick up on that question, though. I'll pick up on that question of.
There we go.
He's back.
Okay, he's on. Go ahead, John.
Sorry about that. The whole screen just locked up. It was weird. So just I would add, because the question that you ask is very interesting. There's an abundance of smoking guns. A remarkable and I find very perfidious fraud that was committed on a very wide scale was this insistence, as people are dying, there's not enough evidence of efficacy. It's like, we can't use any of this stuff. We can't provide it to people in the early outpatient setting because, gosh darn, there's just not enough evidence of efficacy. But as Dr. Harvey Risch, he's an epidemiologist at Yale University, and I spent a whole day with Dr. Risch at his fine house in Connecticut. This is just plainly ridiculous. I mean, it's an example of how, if enough people are saying something and they seem to exude academic authority, we believe this. We believe in its plausibility, even though it doesn't meet the most elementary standards of logic. For example, hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin and ivermectin, just to take three. These are WHO essential medications. Millions and millions of people have taken these drugs for decades. They're very well tolerated. They're safe with pregnant women. The assertion, oh, no one can take these because there's not sufficient proof of efficacy in treating COVID-19. This is just an outright humbug. It's just a fraud. So there's that. But when we get into the mechanics of intrigue, there was a moment it was the last week of March 2020, President Trump, in his sort of awkward way, says, well, there's a professor in Marseille, France, named Didier Raoult. He's just released this sort of proof of concept study in the International Journal of Antimicrobial Agents, showing a signal of benefit with hydroxychloroquine. I think we should push this stuff out. We have a national stockpile. We've augmented it by getting Sanofi and some other guys to donate a stock to it. Let's get it out into the pharmacies, particularly in New Jersey and New York, which are being hit very hard by this thing. And what we see and what we document in our book, and what Dr. Zelenko in New York realized, was that there was an old-fashioned palace intrigue within the Department of Health and Human Services to actively, intentionally block the stock of the national stockpile of hydroxychloroquine from going out to pharmacies. And then there's the complementary claim, it risks people with systemic lupus and rheumatoid arthritis from getting their prescriptions filled. To which I say, well, you're darn right it does, because you're blocking it. I mean, if you fill the pharmacy channels with it, at one and the same time to withhold and to say, oh, we don't want there to be a supply disruption. So I think these people, it's to me, it's revealing. Everybody has seen this in social situations where people say and do things. It's very revealing of their personal habits and ethics. And I think this biopharmaceutical complex, which has captured and developed allies at the federal level, at the institutional and regulatory level, it's a pretty darn ruthless bunch that we're up against here. And they have longstanding habits of favoring expensive patented medications as a policy response to illness. Our book documents this, with the timeline in much the same way as a true crime book will document something like a case of serial murder. We walk the reader through this step by step. We name names, we have timelines. So I think that there's an abundance of smoking guns, and it's very evident in the narrative, which is all cited, by the way.
Yes. So one thing that we saw was during all of this, certainly from policy perspectives and governmental organizations, there was what appears to be malfeasance. But Dr. McCullough, for you, I'd like to ask, did you see um, basically what I would call criminal activity in the academic, realm in terms of perhaps studies designed to fail or created out of, whole cloth, just like, invented studies designed to, shift the thinking around whether or not hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin or some of these things worked, and perhaps studies that were left unpublished because of being held to a different standard based on their outcomes. If you did see this kind of stuff happening, why do you think it happened? What are the incentives that allowed that to happen, or what is the structural issue that allowed that kind of stuff to happen in academia?
I saw an extraordinary sequence of events. The entire medical literature, in a sense, became corrupt. And at the time, I was the editor of two major journals. I have extensive editing experience. I know how this is done. I know how these offices work, and the deputy editors, the publishers. And we were stunned when a paper from Harvard and a company called Surgisphere published a fraudulent paper in Lancet, an intentionally fraudulent paper, supposedly describing people in their 40s hospitalized with SARS-CoV-2, and it hinted that hydroxychloroquine could be harmful. And I first looked at this paper. I said, this doesn't make sense at all. We are hospitalized people in their 80s, not in their 40s, and how could this data have all come together early in December, January of the first few months of the pandemic? And then it was retracted by Lancet after 2 weeks of great discussion and fanfare with no real explanation outside the fact that the data couldn't be verified. A parallel fraudulent paper was published in New England Journal of Medicine concerning the use of a drug called ACE inhibitors, which are chronic heart failure and blood pressure medications, drugs we use for kidney disease as well. So there was some nefarious activity going on. And, I was contacted by Peter Navarro in the White House, one of the first calls I have, when he called me and said, listen, I need help with hydroxychloroquine, that, it's been pigeonholed with this emergency use authorization, which it didn't need actually, to try to restrict it to inpatient use. We've got to get it into the hands of outpatients. Rick Bright in the White House at the time was trying to block the distribution of hydroxychloroquine. Bright later on joins the Rockefeller Foundation supporting vaccine research. And so I work with Peter Navarro to get a support letter and Henry Ford Hospital for outpatient use of hydroxychloroquine. That actually backfires, and the FDA then gives a complete restriction on hydroxychloroquine in the summer of 2020, never to revisit the data. So the first year of the pandemic was closed with an iron fist on hydroxychloroquine when we had nothing else in the offing. And then pick up on the second year, it's the year of ivermectin. And so now the data start coming in with ivermectin that looks, again, signal of benefit, acceptable safety, actually more diverse. Ivermectin seems to work both on inpatient and outpatients. And there we see an all-out overt campaign. The American Medical Association announces a campaign to abolish the use of ivermectin, abolish the use as research is going on and more favorable studies have gone on. Abolish the use. Since when does the American Medical Association take a stake in abolishing the use of ivermectin? We saw countless clinical trials stopped early for unclear reasons. I mean, the most notable trial stopped early was the best done trial in all of COVID-19, and that's the Corona trial. That's a trial of colchicine versus placebo out of the Montreal Heart Institute, prospective, double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trial. The trial was supposed to go to 6,000 patients. Mysteriously, it stopped early at 4,100 patients. The Data Safety Monitoring Board Executive Committee cannot explain why it stopped early. And it stopped early. It barely misses the primary endpoint on the pre-stated, but on the analysis of those positive for reducing hospitalization and death. So the stopping of Corona, and then the publication history. So Corona stands as the largest, highest quality trial in COVID-19. It's submitted to the New England Journal of Medicine. It sits there for several months, delayed, not accepted. Then it goes to Lancet, sat there several months, delayed, not published. Then it goes to JAMA, and delayed. Then goes to Lancet, delayed, and then goes to a lower tier journal. It's delayed by 6 to 8 months getting in the peer-reviewed literature. Well, in the meantime, we're seeing scores of low-quality vaccine studies get published over and over again. It was the publication history of Corona and why it was stopped early, configuration of funding sources. And by the way, one of the common elements across so many trials stopped early is partial funding by the Gates Foundation.
Yeah, that is shocking. I know that they were one of the funders of one of the early fluvoxamine trials, also that Steve Kirsch was pushing for, and it took a really long time to finally get the results of that out. I mean, I had heard that the results through the grapevine many months before it was publicly released. So that, I mean, in the midst of a pandemic, this kind of emergency situation, you would think that would call for an urgency, right? This is the same way that the vaccines were kind of urgently created. You would think that you would have this urgency to put together, like you're saying, both of you, treatment protocols that help people and that were from using medications that were known to have well-known safety profiles for decades. So I just want to shift, I guess, to the other thing that happened in the last couple of years. Obviously there was a lot of malfeasance, certainly around the early treatments being suppressed. At the same time, there was this hyper focus on vaccinating everyone in the population, and other responses like masking and lockdowns, society-wide lockdowns, perhaps modeled off of the Chinese response, although incorrectly because they didn't lock down the entire country. So I'm wondering, around the vaccines specifically, um, what was your impression, Dr. McCullough, of the effort to spin up these, novel therapeutics, or they had to change the definition of vaccine. So these novel injections and novel therapeutics, using a technology that had never been used in human beings before. Um, should we have known? Were there red flags just from the design of these things, and how in those trials were they properly conducted, and should we be, from the very beginning, should we have felt certain that those things had the efficacy that they were claimed to have and the safety that they were claimed to have?
Absolutely. I sent as many warning signals as I could to America. I published an op-ed in the summer of 2020 titled "The Great Gamble of the COVID-19 Vaccine Development Program." We had papers from China by Xi and al. That showed that the lipid nanoparticles alone went to organs that we would not want to see, including the adrenals, the ovaries, the testes, the brain. There's no way we'd want to use lipid nanoparticles as the delivery vehicle. That was the first concerning observation. That looked like a disaster by design. The second is that these were genetic transfer technology platforms that had failed for other diseases. So, these were sitting on the shelf. They did not look favorable at all. And now to use lipid nanoparticles in messenger RNA or adenoviral DNA, it looked like you couldn't come up with a worse idea. Now, what had happened is the genetic code for the spike protein was actually well known before the virus ever, infected a human being. So the fact that the genetic code was known, that the patents were filed for the vaccines long before the illness, that there were planning seminars for a coronavirus pandemic that had gone on, really created a sense that, wait a minute, this was all anticipated. This was all set in stone. And so by April or so, when we heard about neutralizing antibodies against the spike protein, it seemed way too quick. This wasn't Operation Warp Speed. The documents suggested this was all set in place a long time ago. So adenoviral DNA, messenger RNA loaded on lipid nanoparticles, injected into the deltoid, and then the installation of genetic code for a potentially lethal spike protein that was devised in a biosafety level 4 lab in China to the entire American population. I mean, the whole thought of that was just absolutely disturbing. And 80% of Americans now have accepted the genetic code from a biosafety lab in Wuhan, China, into their body. And everything we've learned about it from that point forward has been bad news.
Definitely. John, there was a FOIA request around the some of the emails going back and forth between Fauci and members of the EcoHealth Alliance. Did you go down that rabbit hole and investigate like what, maybe try to get into his head, Fauci's head, or try to come up with like why he chose to do what he did, in terms of like lockdowns and masking, when there was a lot of data from prior respiratory diseases showing that masking didn't really have much of an effect on flu transmission, certainly, and lockdowns have really never been used in human history the way that they were in the United States and a lot of Western countries. What was it about, I don't know, the psychology or just the incentives? I mean, why did the administration take the route that it did? Like, why do you think that Fauci and the CDC did what they did?
It doesn't require any real thinking or deductive reasoning. You just read their own documents. Fauci and Bill Gates are very good friends. They've stated this in a podcast. They've had a close alliance since the year 2000. And Bill Gates and the World Economic Forum, they founded an institution in the year 2017 called CEPI, the Center for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations. They actually published a business plan in 2017 in which they explicitly state a pandemic is coming, it's even imminent, and when it comes, our business plan is going to enable these extremely far-reaching networks of partnerships across the globe, pharmaceutical companies, national governments, national treasuries, the financing people, to have a partnership that is explicitly presented in the business plan as an opportunity. So, pandemic is coming, and it presents the following opportunity. And it's a 65-page business plan that says the opportunity is rapidly developing new vaccines for it. The entire partnership, this entire nexus of relationships with tremendous amounts of money and science, pharmaceutical companies, academic researchers, guys that are receiving grant money from the Gates Foundation. The opportunity is to quickly create and rapidly deploy vaccines. And so when the NIAID announces on March the 16th, 2020, we've got this new Moderna messenger RNA vaccine in development, and we're even starting human trials on March the 16th, which is remarkable. I mean, this is just a few days after the WHO declares it a true pandemic, and they've already got a messenger RNA vaccine in human trials. The press release states CEPI is providing the financing for manufacturing this new agent. So when SARS-CoV-2 arrived, it just pressed the button of CEPI's business plan, which was published in 2017. And what's notable is there is not one mention in the 2017 business plan of treatment. That there is only one solution. It's one monolithic solution, and we will pursue it with all available resources, and that is mass vaccination. So I think about a week after the NIAID announces that they've got this new mRNA vaccine with Moderna, Bill Gates comes out and writes an op-ed in the Washington Post in which he says, well, there aren't any effective medications against this. Maybe remdesivir could help a little bit. We'll only be able to go back to normal when every man, woman, and child on Earth receives the vaccine. And good news, my foundation is working on developing one. We're going to ramp up production even before, and he explicitly states this, we're going to ramp up production of this new vaccine even before the trial data comes in. We don't have time to wait. So this is all explicitly stated. It's published. There's videotapes of simulation events in which it's somebody is telling you, this is what's going to happen, and when it happens, this is what I'm going to do. And you can't say the man didn't tell you what he was going to do. So I think that the thing that Dr. Mccullough and I marveled at is that there's nothing concealed. There's no reason really for discovery. I mean, if we want to get into criminal prosecution, there'll have to be a discovery. But I think for the public in general, the available evidence is very clear of what has happened here. And we lay it out in our book in a clear narrative fashion. If you gentlemen will allow me to make an administrative point, Dr. Mccullough and I are due to speak with some other gentlemen in 3 minutes.
Okay.
Sorry to
Okay.
be
We'll wrap it
abrupt.
up. No, thank you for reminding me. Yeah. So I'll wrap it up and let you guys go in a couple of minutes. Dr. McCullough, sending it back to you, just maybe serve for some closing thoughts. Do you see a way forward for medicine, given what's happened in the last couple of years? What is our way forward?
Well, I can tell you we are now on another increasing rate of infections, largely infecting the fully vaccinated or partially vaccinated. So we need to apply early treatment to high-risk patients. Color protocol, fully available, copyrighted FLCC protocols. There are many, but patients need treatment to handle viral replication, cytokine storm, and thrombosis. That would be the key point. The key path forward is to treat and treat early, because that reduces the spread of the virus. If we let patients go untreated, the spread is uncontrolled until the point of hospitalization. We can't let that happen. And then for medicine broadly going forward, I think there's a giant cataclysmic shift. Patients have lost their trust in the biopharmaceutical complex, which includes hospitals, clinics, and big health systems. The heroes are the independent doctors. The doctors always put their patients first. And I think we're going to see a giant shift in principles. I think there'll be a tremendous independence and really superiority of the independent physician over the rank and file employed physician. And patients will express this and make this happen with their point of preference and their choice and their willingness to actually put their money on the line for that type of care.
Thank you so much, both of you. I'll let you go. It was truly a pleasure. I really value the time that you gave today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Dr. McCullough.
Thank you.
All right, so that was fantastic, and I would just I'd like to thank both of them again. They've done tremendous work, and they are both very brave to come forward and write a book and publish it and bring all of this to light for everyone in the world, really. And it is really important. I would highly recommend everyone go to couragetofacecovid.com, pick up a copy, and pick up multiple copies, send them to everyone that you know. And it's for two reasons. One is to spread the knowledge, and second of all, to just, I think both are really important. One is spreading the knowledge, and the second is to help support people like Dr. McCullough and John Leake, who are coming forward and risking their, reputations for sure, and their, their prospects, their future prospects in industry and academia, and it takes people like this who have this kind of bravery, right, to change the prevailing paradigm, right? And in every age there are heroes, that come forward and they fight against the establishment when it's wrong, and they eventually overturn the establishment, and that's what we're going to see here. Dr. McCullough and John Leake, these are two of the giants in this movement, and please do everything you can to support them. Thank you, everyone, for listening today, and please like and subscribe and spread this. I think this is one of the most important videos that I've done so far. Thanks.